Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the 2024-2025 Innovation North Speaker Series. We're very excited to have you all here today. My name is Liz Miller, and I'm a postdoctoral associate with Innovation North. Innovation North is a community of researchers that seeks to solve organizational and ecosystem challenges. We partner with businesses, nonprofits, and governments to co-create novel solutions to complex challenges. We're based at IB Business School at the University of Western Ontario, which is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape'wak, and Chinootan nations. Innovation North Speaker Series invites experts, either academics or practitioners, or in some cases both, to share their experiences and perspectives on topics related to systems innovation. I'm very excited to introduce today's speakers, Ralph Hamann and Rebecca Freeth. Ralph is a professor and deputy director of faculty and research at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. His research and teaching is on strategy and sustainability, social innovation and entrepreneurship, and cross-sector collaboration. Among his other roles, he's a co-founder and director of the Embedding Project South Africa and the Southern Africa Food Lab, initiatives which bridge both research and practice. And Rebecca is a practitioner and scholar who researches, teaches, facilitates, and writes about collaboration. Rebecca is a senior consultant with the Reos Partners Africa office, where her work focuses on systemic issues such as dismantling structural racism, gender-based violence, education, and organizational culture change. She leads Reos Africa's work in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So a bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat along the way, and then there'll also be just time for a discussion at the end. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to Ralph and Rebecca.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. And thanks very much for this wonderful invitation to share a bit of our story and our experience of the Food Lab. And it's great to have Rebecca with me as well, who's been part of this journey for many years. And it's also really wonderful to have such wonderful colleagues joining us today with amazing insights and experience in these themes. So it's a really great opportunity, which we're really appreciative of. So I'm going to go straight into our presentation. Rebecca and me are really keen to have a good conversation after our initial input to set the scene. I don't know if you can hear the birds. There's some very loud birds outside my window.
Yeah, we can. It's good, Ralph.
It's a bird that those of you who've been to Cape Town will know. They're called hardy-does, and it's the name is the sound that they make. They are so loud, and one's right next to my window. But I think it'll fly off in a moment. Anyway, so we're gonna present for about 25 minutes, half an hour, so we have a good chunk of time for conversation. Both Rebecca and I are really keen to focus on conversation afterwards. So let me go straight to the slides. Here we are, and maybe just Liz, is this fine?
Yes, you're good.
All right, good. So this is the topic. We're going to talk about convening dialogue for social innovation. What does it take? And we'll really focus on the experience of this initiative called Southern Africa Food Lab. I am at the Graduate School of Business. Rebecca's at Reos Partners. And we are basing our input really on this article that was published quite recently in Strategic Organization, which focuses on this question of, when and how does it make sense for researchers to be conveners of this kind of dialogue? And I think Innovation North is a great host for this specific conversation also because, in some ways there's quite a lot of similarities between what I think Innovation North is doing, as well as many others on the call this afternoon or this morning. And and what we've been trying to do in the food lab and what we're reflecting on in this paper. But at the same time, I'll let Rebecca speak to some other questions that we have in the back of our minds.
Thanks, Ralph. So exactly that. While we present this to you, the questions that are perhaps most alive for us at the moment are about the implications for convening dialogue for social innovation more broadly, and also the implications for all of us at this moment in time of disruption. And we are hoping that the discussion after the presentation will maybe open up some of that kind of conversation. Thanks, Ralph.
All right, great. So I will spend just a minute or two on a little bit of the academic context for this particular paper. So, there's, I think, broad agreement that convening diverse stakeholders in dialogue processes can be a helpful thing to address the complex social and ecological challenges and problems that all of us on this call are interested in. And of course, some of you who are on this call have written about this, but people like Sylvia Dorado and Tom Lawrence and so on, those are just some of the authors that have really emphasized and explained some of those reasons or those motivations for dialogue. And what we've been really intrigued by is how that the literature has given some initial hints at the potential for researchers to play an active role as conveners. So there's a great piece by Amanda Williams and Gail Whiteman that some of you might know that talks about their experience. In this particular paper, they're talking about the Arctic Base Camp and just how challenging, but also how generative it was for them to become involved in this kind of initiative. But they don't really unpack the affordances beyond statements like leveraging academic skills, like in this quote I have here. At the same time, Amanda and Gail, they also talk about just how demanding this kind of thing can be. And Barbara Gray has an important article on convening dialogue and the role of power imbalances in these kinds of processes. And they actually warn against, potentially naive researchers like ourselves doing this kind of thing because of these power dynamics and because of the quite specific skills that conveners and facilitators of dialogue probably need, right? So I think this was a kind of a caution, which also then motivated us to reflect on our own journey, which has now gone on for about over 15 years to really address this question, what are the affordances, but also the tensions or challenges associated with researchers convening such dialogue processes. So I want to just briefly tell a little bit of the genesis of this initiative. It started quite long ago, around 2008. And I want to start with a moment that for me personally, at least, was a trigger for this. This was sorry, the date was wrong. This is in 2008 or 2009. I was interested in doing research on this idea of co-opetition, which is competitors collaborating in the public interest. And I spoke to a bunch of senior managers, especially of retail companies. And I remember sitting in this very kind of quite grand office of a corporate affairs director of one of our main retail companies in South Africa. And I said to her, I basically asked her the question, what kind of issue comes to mind when that would motivate competitors coming together to address shared problems in a collaborative way? And there was this very dramatic moment because she didn't even hesitate for a moment. She turned around and took this big folder off her desk with newspaper clippings, and she threw it down on the desk in front of us, and it spread out all over this big fancy desk of hers. And it was all these newspaper clippings about the food price crisis in 2008, 2009, right? So some of you might remember this. This was a massive spike in food prices. This is a FAO data. So you know, a lot of rioting in very diverse parts of the world. And this retailer was saying, we are in the business of food. And if we become identified with being part of the problem, this is going to be a severe risk to our business. And at the same time, I was in a geography department, and friends of mine were doing research on urban food security to really show that the assumption that many of us had at the time, which is that food insecurity was a rural issue in places like South Africa, it showed that that was an entirely misplaced assumption. And many people in what we call our townships, the informal and poor areas of our cities, are severely food insecure. So it really catalyzed. So the sense of crisis and the sense of also getting better data catalyzed this belief that something needed to be done. So initially, as researchers, of course, what we would do is do some research, and we did some bunch of interviews on this question of diverse stakeholders collaborating on this issue of food insecurity, and that gave rise to an article in a development journal. But we also were inspired by a bunch of initiatives at the time that were quite prominent then, but and still are to some extent. Some of you will know the Sustainable Food Laboratory. We had some great discussions with the founders of that. We also were inspired by the work of Otto Scharmer and Adam Kahane, who's spoken here previously in this series, who had written books that came out around about that time around how to bring different stakeholders together in dialogue to address complex problems. So a friend and colleague of mine who's in fact a nutritionist, we just had lots of informal conversations, and we said, well, there is a need for bringing people together, but nobody else is doing this, so we might as well do this. So she's also an academic at a kind of a sister university here in the area, and Miller McLachlan, that's her in the top right here. So we organized a workshop, a one-day workshop in Johannesburg, and it was really striking just how many people were inspired to join, and were really quite enthusiastic about this opportunity to discuss these issues. And again, the sense of crisis was an important motivator, I think. And so I'm going to quickly, this was in 2009, and so a lot has happened since then. There's no point in trying to give you an overview of all the various different initiatives and processes. I'm going to give you a snapshot of one thematic focus, which is around supporting smallholder farmers, who play clearly a very important role in our food system. And I'm going to use the U of theory U that I'm guessing most of you have come across, just to give you a couple of key moments in that kind of process. And what I must just add is that we went through this kind of U process multiple times, normally in something like 18-month duration kind of cycles. And I'll get back to the cycling of this in a moment. But essentially, the first stage was to bring together a bunch of actors in the system. And so on the topic of smallholder farmers, of course, it would include the farmers themselves to the extent that they were organized. We would have associations as part of this. Sometimes we just invited small-scale farmers themselves. We would visit a lot of small-scale farmers and talk to them. We would also have government, academics, sometimes, and also larger businesses, right? People that would buy from suppliers, retailers, food manufacturers, whoever we thought was playing an active role, important role in the system. And we could have a whole other conversation about, how do we identify these people and how do we make sure they actually rock up when we have these events and these learning journeys. But that would take us in a different direction for now. And what we would do, one of the things that we would do is go on these learning journeys, right? So we would have a group like the one in the picture here, and we would take, sometimes we would just have a 1-day learning journey. Sometimes it would be 3 or even 4 days to go into quite far-flung parts of the country. And what was really important is that in those journeys, it's the kind of conversations that happen, for example, in the bus, right? So we have 12 people in a kind of a medium-sized bus, and after the meetings with, let's say, avocado farmers and some farm in the rural areas of Limpopo, we would all get back in the bus, and everyone would be a little bit exhausted from the heat and be relieved that there's an air condition in the bus. But then you'd also have these conversations between people in the bus, which often turned out to be incredibly important, right? And for one example, there was a government official that was concerned about his work as an extension service provider at a national government level. And it was really striking when he started talking about this, and one of the academics had done a lot of research about small-scale farmers and then provided a response to this official saying, in our research, we've identified that there's these very significant differences between different categories of small-scale farmers. And something as, ostensibly simple as that actually catalyzed a shift in the way that government went about structuring and organizing its extension service. And after a long day's driving around in a bus, speaking to farmers, speaking to retailers, and so on, we would then go to, some kind of guest house. And this other event comes to mind where the 4 big retailers in our country, in this particular learning journey, they were part of this, and they witnessed firsthand some of the challenges faced by small-scale farmers. And I remember this moment where we were all just trying to relax after a long day out in the heat. And these 3 buyers were sitting at the bar and relaxing and just chatting and having a beer and, just trying to relax. And in that conversation, that's what catalyzed what I think is one of the important initiatives from this work, which is this thing called local GAP, which is an adaptation of global GAP, which GAP stands for global, the good agricultural practices. But it's basically the standards that retailers and others impose on suppliers, food suppliers. And they're often very exclusionary for small-scale farmers. And so we developed, that catalyzed the process of developing a localized version of these standards that made it a little bit easier for smaller farmers to abide by and to become part of these very important supply chains. And that was, the moment that catalyzed that was something that was very difficult to force. It was something that emerged from these kinds of learning journey experiences. Here's another initiative that then brought some of this insights into a particular part of the countryside where we worked with small-scale farmers to innovate around farming practices. For example, these raised beds that you see there behind the stones. And they turned out to be really important because this part of the country is prone to very extreme weather. So there was a big flood. And the farmers that we've been working with were essentially spared the worst of the flooding because these raised beds saved their crops. So again, I can't go into much more detail. I hope I could just give a little bit of flavor here. And there's also quite a lot more about the lab on the website. So please have a look at that if you want a little bit more information. There's a blog and there's a bit more about the history and so on. So let me quickly then go into the findings in the paper. What specifically were the affordances that we identified just reflecting back at these 15 years as researchers, right? So the first I want to mention is that this is a remarkably contested and in some ways controversial space. There's people that have quite disparate views of what the problem is, what is the role of the corporate sector in the food system, what is the role of the government. People have low levels of trust, a lot of kind of naming and blaming going on. And so it turned out, and this was, to be honest, this was a bit of a surprise. We didn't know this. We didn't expect this at the beginning. But people recognized, or at least they had a kind of a hope, that as university researchers, we had some level of neutrality. Wangen and Huxham, they refer to this notion of identity-based trust in terms of who we are in the institutional system. And there's this quote I remember when at one point, as a researcher, for a while I was chairing the board, and I was basically suggesting that I wanted to hand it over, but there was a real concern that it should be an academic, because ostensibly there's some degree of neutrality there. The second one is that as researchers, we were cheap in some ways. We had our salaries. We did not, like consultants, have to bill a client by the day or the hour, right? And so what we realized is that in this 15-year journey, there were these periods where there was a lot of intense activity there, and a lot of the times that was because we had funding for that. So we would often get grants from development agencies, or perhaps corporate grants or something like that. And then there would be a period of kind of a hiatus or a lull. And as research or as academics, we could tide things over between those periods of activity, and basically keep things active, keep people engaged. We organized breakfast meetings, and we didn't need a lot of money. We could also use university venues and so on. We just needed a little bit of money for food and catering and so on. And that really was helpful. And here's a kind of a graphic description of this, where, we realize there's this fluctuation or this kind of wave in terms of the resources available to us over the years. And it would be kind of 18-month or 2 or 3 year cycles of where external resources were available, and then there would be a lull. And that the length of that varied, but sometimes it was a couple of months, sometimes it was actually 2 or 3 years. And I'm just mentioning some of the specific dialogue processes on top. So for instance, we had a smallholder farmer focused dialogue right at the beginning, 2010, 2011, and then the funding ran out, and basically, for something like, better part of a year, we had to tide things over. But it was the other thing we realized is that the first process did not result in very tangible impacts beyond the participants themselves, but they created a fertile soil for a subsequent process to be conceptualized, to be resourced and funded, because we could write a good proposal building on the first process. And the kinds of engagement, the kinds of knowledge of the system, but also the knowledge of each other and the knowledge of dialogue as a kind of generative process, were all at a much higher level in the second round, so to speak. And those are the ones, the second iterations, that then resulted in the kinds of institutionally relevant outcomes that I mentioned a moment ago, like local gap, for example. We call them proto-institutional outcomes, following some of the work of Tom Lawrence in this space. So let me quickly talk about challenges and tensions. The first I want to highlight is this tension between whether we are content experts or process custodians. And essentially, we encountered quite varying expectations that were levied upon us by diverse participants. Some of them really looked at us and they saw academics. They assumed that we would try to draw quite clear boundaries between, fact and falsehood, that we would provide data and analysis. And so they were sometimes a bit disappointed or even irritated when we said, well, yes, we can bring other academics into the conversation who are experts in this field, but as far as we are concerned, we actually see ourselves as some more of a custodian of the process, right? And the second quote goes in that direction, where some of the participants really appreciated the fact that, some of the emphases around what stands as true or false or good or bad knowledge was held lightly, because we wanted people to loosen their view, or open themselves up a little bit, to be surprised, to be to change their minds as well, right? And that wasn't going to happen if there was a debating mode where people were very tightly focused on what's right and what's wrong. And so the second tension was between expectation that we needed radical change in the system, or we basically needed to just maintain the system but improve its functionality. And so, building on the work of Parsons, already quite, kind of classic work in 1950s, who talked about this idea, of a functional system perspective. There were quite a few people that said, don't rock the boat too much, because that's just going to mess things around. Let's just improve efficiencies, improve transparency, and things like that. On the other hand, there were, as you can imagine, especially maybe on the side of some of the more radical NGOs and so on, they had a different analysis. They said the system is fundamentally rotten, and it's basically controlled by greedy corporations. We need to more fundamentally change the system. And so, just to give you some indication, we came across some quite diverse perspectives of our role as the lab. Some, criticized this as passionate advocates for supermarkets, right? So this was obviously from a radical perspective that was critical of us as the lab, that they saw us as being too much on the functional side. And then at the same time, we would have others who actually were concerned that we had a punishment mindset towards retail and other corporations. And so it was quite remarkable. Like within a day, we would have these quite radically divergent views of what we stood for, what we were expected to drive as an agenda. And so, in our paper, we describe this in more detail. But essentially, for many, for about 5-6 years, we had quite an identity crisis, as it were, right? Because with these two tensions, they map onto each other in an orthogonal way, in a way that gives rise to these kind of four, almost these stereotypes of what people expected us to be as the facilitators and the conveners. Some wanted us to be a radical expert that provided knowledge to undermine the system. Some wanted us to be a functional expert to improve the current system with knowledge and data. On the other hand, also as far as being a custodian of the process is concerned, people said, well, we need to exclude the corporations because they are the problem. Therefore, they expected us to be a radical custodian. And then some of the other side, so to speak, said, well, we can't have these radical NGOs in the room. You need to be a functional custodian. So, the point is that for quite a few years, we really struggled with these diverse expectations leveled upon us. And what the paper is also then describing is this shift to a different kind of conception of what dialogue is about. And I mean, for lack of a better word, we call it deep dialogue as opposed to shallow dialogue. And shallow dialogue is this idea of basically trying to seek consensus, trying to really reach agreement, very tangible agreement about what to do and what to do different. Whereas deep dialogue is based on some of the philosophies that we describe in our paper that are really not so much concerned with consensus, but really bringing a whole person into dialogue with each other, where dialogue has this kind of inherent value that is, in fact, needs to be independent of the instrumental results or outcomes of the interaction. And so two aspects we wanted to highlight here is one is radical inclusion. So we didn't want to exclude anyone. So we developed a posture to say we're not going to exclude corporations, we're not going to exclude radical NGOs, but so we are going to have this posture of inclusion, but it's going to be radical in the sense that we will make particular effort to involve those that are currently excluded from the system. And in the farming example, that was especially the small-scale farmers. This idea of actor complexification and role fluidity means that we wanted to encourage people not to be representatives of their organizations or their institutions. That as individuals, we are much more complex than the corporate manager title or identity that we bring into a room. Right? And the more we can enable that broadening of self-conceptions, as well as, kind of assumed roles in interaction with others, then the more likely we would have a generative conversation in this space. And we have this picture in the paper that shifted, this matrix, so to speak, and there was less of a feeling of being pulled and torn between one view and the other, because there was more fluidity, more role fluidity, where we could move in this kind of triangle between radical expert, functional expert, and a radical inclusionary approach that collapses the custodian perspectives on the left-hand side. Anyway, so let me move on to Rebecca, who's going to tell two stories to illustrate what that looked like and what some of the benefits of that kind of approach were.
Thanks so much, Ralph. So I'll tell two stories which are about hot moments in different times and different parts of the food lab. And hot moments are literally when it feels like the temperature in the room is suddenly escalating. And these are often moments of disruption that allow us to move from a more superficial dialogue to a deeper dialogue and really address questions of inclusion and exclusion. The first example is when I was lead facilitator of one of the final workshops in the project called Supporting Smallholder Farmers, the second part of that Ralph mentioned. And we were in what may be very familiar to you. We were in this lab process where people were coming up with ideas for how they could address some of the systemic issues that exclude small-scale farmers and create obstacles to small-scale farmers entering formal food chains. And so a lot of the kind of stakeholders were physically in the room, including policymakers, small-scale farmers themselves, activists, academics, people in retail and different parts of the more corporate system. And there was a lot of energy in the room. I was noticing this. We were at round tables and it was a big room. And I suddenly just, not long before we were closing, I suddenly saw a pattern of of what was happening kind of activity and energy wise in the room. And I realized that the room had kind of reconstellated itself into a lot of, and I'm going to use racial identity terms here. We're quite good at doing this in the South African context, but it may be less familiar to you. And I hope it's not too crude. But a lot of the people sitting at the middle table who were exuding lots of excitement and energy and were full of ideas and had a lot to say were white men. And a lot of the people who were more on the periphery of the room and whose body language was showing that they were disengaging from the process were Black, often small-scale farmers themselves. And so after really hesitating over this, I named it. And I knew it would go down badly. I knew the timing was terrible just before we ended. But it felt too important because there was a real risk that we were going to recreate exactly the dynamics of, the food system, the commercial formal food system, often being led by white men, and inadvertently sometimes excluding others from entering. And it seemed like exactly that was happening in the lab again. So I named it, and it caused serious discomfort. And there was a moment of silence, and then there was a big buzz, and I just said, let's reflect on it. And what happened, I'll just name two things that kind of were catalyzed by that, is that one of the white men immediately made a beeline for one of the Black women who is a leader of small-scale farming. She ran an association of small-scale farmers in one of the rural areas. And he just went straight to her and said, how can I support your leadership? And out of that came some really interesting areas of innovation, which they worked on together. And a second reaction was that an older white man was incredibly unhappy with my intervention and wrote a strongly worded email. I think it was to you, Ralph, as the convener, and said that that was inappropriate. And so we kind of engaged with him at that level as well. So that's one example. But the point is that we could no longer remain superficial. We were naming some stuff, and that has gone. That was a real turning point for many people in the lab. And a second moment, another moment, if you can move that slide on, Ralph, is right at the a kind of public launch event of the scenarios that were co-created by multi-stakeholders called the South African Food Futures. This was held at a university venue, so again, using an academic venue. It brought together all of the people who have been part of co-creating these scenarios. And if you were present when Adam Kahane presented to this forum, he may have spoken about the methodology we use called transformative scenarios. And the keynote speaker was a pretty fiery academic, and she named the corporate sector within the food system as psychopaths in this big gathering, and then went on to speak about the food system as a burning house, a house on fire, that actually just needs to be demolished and dismantled. And that what the food lab was doing and what the scenarios were doing was trying to somehow rescue this burning house. And our efforts were kind of too reformist and too potentially ineffective to really get to the root issues. And so she was really taking apart the scenarios, but also a lot of people who were in the room. And so again, a hot moment. Temperature goes up. People are feeling defensive. Some of the corporate leaders who've been part of the scenarios were, getting really hot under the collar about the way that they were being characterized. And then one of the members of the scenario team stood up after the keynote address and said, we know how to deal with this kind of a moment. We've been preparing for this. We've been having tough conversations as the scenarios were being developed. We've got to know each other. We've built the relationships that can hold a difficult conversation like this without us polarizing. So again, an opportunity to really say what's most important here, and without things falling apart, but being able to go deeper and being able to have a different kind of conversation. Back to you, Ralph.
All right, great. Thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, moving swiftly to the conclusion, I want to just wrap it up. I think I'm just reiterating here on this slide some of the key points that we made about some of the affordances that we had that really encourage us as researchers to consider doing this kind of work. But in some ways, too, as far as Innovation North is concerned, I think I'm speaking to the converted here. We identify these tensions that are especially salient for researchers, but perhaps in some ways also to facilitators of this kind of process more broadly. And Rebecca will conclude on that in a moment. And then we really try to shift our sense of how we define dialogue and to move towards this deeper conception that does not emphasize consensus, but more what we call this, authentic intersubjective encounters between whole persons, and the real generative potential for that. And I think Rebecca's vignettes really also speak to that, because out of both of those moments came both the energy, but also the insights for people to interact in different kinds of ways to try to make positive change in the system. And so, Rebecca, you can finish off on the last conclusion slide here.
Thanks. So what we're seeing here is that, this is not just for academics who are conveners, but for anybody who's convening. It's important to be aware that there are ways that you can foster a degree of perceived neutrality. So, for example, who we go to for funding and how we get funding can make sure that we avoid the more potentially, controversial funders or seek funding from others who are also perceived as more neutral. That the way that we create our M&E or MEL systems also need to be really attentive to the long-term impacts, to how certain features of the work can lay the ground, the fertile soil, as Ralph said, for future work. And so how do you create the kind of indicators that allow you to look for the right things when you're conducting M&E, and help you to understand at often a more granular level and also longer term level what some of the impacts might be. And as Ralph said, some of the ways in which researchers as conveners can support staying power and can support this, the way that budgets are organized in funding proposals. And then I think we've got a couple more points at the bottom there. If you click one more time, Ralph. Yeah. So what we're interested in right now is how, when there was a food crisis in 2008, that created fertile ground. And what is the crisis? How do we think about crisis now as fertile ground for dialogue and for fresh thinking and for innovation? So when I talk about dialogue, I'm always talking about dialogue for innovation. And then how an embodied shift to deep dialogue can really support people to de-escalate polarized situations and find, a multitude of perspectives and learn to listen to a multitude of perspectives. So that's us. Thank you for listening. We went on longer than we planned to, but I hope that we can now open up into whatever conversation is, most interesting to you right now.
Thank you so much, Ralph and Rebecca, for sharing all of your insights. So as Rebecca said, now we have space for questions. So feel free to either put your questions in the chat or just raise your hand or on mic, unmute yourself and speak freely. I know Ralph and Rebecca want to keep it very conversational dialogue. Maybe I'll kick us off to break the ice then. If you could go back and start the food lab over, would you do anything differently?
Rebecca, you want to have a go?
I think that we did a reasonably good job. And when I say we, I'm actually giving full credit to Ralph and Miller here as the conveners of getting, I think, many of the right people into the room. And I think that is the key, such a key part of convening, is really taking your time to make sure that as conveners, as trusted brokers of dialogue and innovation, you work hard to convince people to come along because their voice, their perspective is needed. So I'd like to invite you in there, Ralph, and say, when you look at that first convening, how do you think you and Miller did in terms of getting the right people there and enough people there from the different perspectives?
Thanks, Rebecca. I mean, I think the moment was right. The moment helped us, right? So we put and the fact that we had spoken to many of the key actors in this research project that I mentioned briefly. So we knew people personally, and that became, also because of the Reos way of doing things, having these so-called dialogue interviews before we actually have a convening has been, for the most part, been part of a designed process like this. And having one-on-one personal interactions before we bring different people into the room has generally been quite an important part of the process. And that helped already way in the beginning. And we did that almost as a fluke, as a kind of as a luck. We lucked into that. But Liz, I just want to very briefly say something in response to your question, which is, if I were to do something differently, I think the temptation would have been to do things differently to avoid some of the very awkward and sometimes uncomfortable experiences that we had as conveners. But that would have been a mistake, because it was precisely those awkward and uncomfortable moments that helped us over time, and in a very imperfect kind of way, in a very kind of roundabout and up and down kind of way, become more comfortable with those awkward moments. And I think that's been something that's been very important for us in this 15 years, is to almost appreciate those awkward moments, because they are the ones that often turned out to be generative and unlock the situation. So it's, if we were to do things differently, the temptation would be to avoid those, but it's not a good idea. Tima.
We have time with you later as well. So I'm going to let Sandra go next, Sandra and Laurel, and then I can ask my question in private time.
Oh, it's more of a comment or a sort of a question. It took a lot of courage to do the things that Rebecca talked about, and a real skill as a facilitator to stand in that moment and not be afraid of the blowback that was going to happen. So I'm wondering how you came to those skills and what advice you would give to others about that.
Thank you. So, my colleague Adam Kahane, who sends his regards to everybody, I had breakfast with him this morning, has just published a new book called Everyday Habits of Systems Transformers. And habit number 4 is about working the cracks. And I was hosting one of the launch events recently for the book. And we asked, of the 7 habits in this book, which of the habits do people feel is their superpower? And when I asked about habit 4, working the cracks, I was the only person who put up their hand. and I think it's a personal, it's a personality trait, it's a personal disposition that means that my energy levels go up. I pay much better attention when the heat rises and when the cracks become obvious in a situation, because that is, for me, the moment of disruption is the most exciting moment. So when somebody goes off script, when somebody gets angry, when somebody expresses frustration, I want to lean into that moment, because that's when we stop being polite and stay on the surface. And for me, the moment of opportunity is there. So I think you just need one person in your facilitation team who likes heat. And that doesn't mean that I enjoy those moments, Sandra. I actually find them like incredibly painful. And I was literally shaking when I said this, because I knew it would be such an unpopular thing to say with the most powerful people in the room. And I knew there would be consequences, but there's something in me that can't stop. And Ralph's seen me do this a couple of times, sometimes a bit over the top. But yeah, I think you need somebody who enjoys cracks, enjoys heat in your team.
Yeah, if I could just to add to that, those moments that are it seems to me, and the way you described it brought tears to my eyes, actually. Those are the generative moments. And unless more of us, and certainly I'm not one of these people that can do this, but unless more of us can develop the skill to stand in that moment and push it forward so that you can get people talking together in the ways that you did, then maybe transformation is not going to happen. Just a thought.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I think those are great, a great question, and great comments. And thanks, Rebecca. I mean, we actually have, for example, in our EMBA program, we have this quite eccentric teacher who's now, in his 70s, but we always pull him back into the class. His expertise is to create those moments that Rebecca's been talking about in the classroom, and to almost trigger people in ways that really take people to their edge, and precisely to give them a bit of that muscle, to build that muscle, so that when they're in the workplace, they don't react, they can respond, right? They can hold themselves back for a bit and then respond from a more, in a sense, a deeper place than just a quick reaction. Laura.
Thanks, and wonderful talk. And Ralph, great to see you, and Rebecca, wonderful to meet you. So I've got one question, but I also want to link back to what Sandra was saying. And I think that if you look at transformative learning, they talk about the need to have a disorientating dilemma and also self-reflexivity, right? They're key components in actually getting people to be willing to lean into discomfort and to then engage in more of a transformative path that leads to new solutions. So it sounded a lot of resonance there with kind of that literature. But my question for Ralph and Rebecca is, how do you remain seemingly neutral in these conversations, which can be really hard as an academic especially when you see the injustices? And so like, how do you remain neutral enough so that you can bring people along?
You want to go first, Rebecca?
No, I do not. Over to you, Ralph.
So thanks, Laura. Great points and questions. So two things. to the first thing that you were saying, I think we mentioned it, but we didn't really have time to go into it. There's a really important thing that also speaks to Sandra's point, which is that the kind of challenge that Sandra pointed to is not just an intellectual capability. It's very much an embodied thing. Because the discomfort that comes, I mean, Rebecca, in that moment, you realize that this was going to be super disruptive, very unpopular, especially with the people that you were calling out in a way. And I think all of us have a physical embodied reaction that would say, don't go there, right? We don't want that kind of discomfort. It's a physical sensation. And so I think what's been quite important in trying to understand and also just years of trying this out have, at least to some extent, helped us realize it's okay to feel that discomfort, and in fact that can be useful. And so I think the embodied nature of this is really important. It's not just intellectual cognitive recognition. It's something about how we bring our bodies into this kind of role.
And Ralph, I just want to build on that and say, often we're worried about making those empowered uncomfortable, when in fact, the other people that aren't in power are already uncomfortable. So it's about whose comfort are you prioritizing? But you're right about the embodied aspect. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, for sure. And this very briefly to your question, I think as we move to this idea of, showing up as kind of whole persons rather than representatives of particular institutionalized roles, we actually became less concerned about this notion of neutrality. We actually, as a convener, sometimes we would just weigh in and say, well, I think X or Y. And it was interesting, I think, because we had, basically moved along as a group, people would also respond to that in less of a, defensive way, or in a way that would kind of put us in a box as, oh, okay, now Ralph is a corporate defender or something, because they would know that the next day, depending on the circumstances, I would come with quite a different perspective, because there was more fluidity. So I think this notion of role fluidity is quite a big part of that idea that we're trying to bring across. So neutrality became less important to us, actually. And who knows, maybe it was only possible because we had been doing this for 10, 12 years and people got to know us and they became a little bit less stressed about us sometimes saying odd things.
And I'll let go of responding. Liz, do we have time for Faranani to ask a question?
Yeah, we have time for Faranani's question. And Rebecca, there's a question in the chat from Olga about trainings. Maybe if you want to just type a response if there's anything there. But yeah, Faranani, please go ahead.
Okay, no, thank you. Thanks a lot, Ralph and Rebecca, for such an amazing talk. And yeah, I think my perspective is mainly more just a comment and something that stood out for me. And, it's a non-academic perspective. I'm a community practitioner in rural communities, mainly around Limpopo. So yeah, when you mentioned when you had your engagements with smallholder farmers in Limpopo, and then you mentioned the issue around, more productive conversations would happen in the buses. I'm just glad, something like that came out, because I think most of the engagements we had also mainly in our rural setups is that usually people, my perspective will be rural. I've worked a lot with rural communities. When you sit and you try and discuss challenges or areas that need intervention and issues like that, they try and speak only about collective problems. And then sometimes these people have different challenges that might need, different support from me and then different support from the next person. And then there's also this notion that if we bring about too many issues, we might not get the interventions that we need as a community. And then this tends to, get people not talking about their challenges. And I'll also share an example. It happened also, we learned this during COVID. So we had support for our traditional healers as well as small businesses, SMMEs, and also small farmers. So we had a provision of food program. And then usually these people are excluded because we would say we need registered, business owners, you need to meet a certain criteria. But then for that period, we were like, no, it will be open. But then what we learned during that, when we engaged, what the challenges are, we realized we've engaged with these people and some of these challenges have not been brought up, And then the fact that we're going and engaging with these people on an individual basis, I think brought about these challenges, and then it also informed, the interventions that came about from that process. And then also the story that you shared, Rebecca, when you were on your program with smallholder farmers, and then, the table, the white vocal people are, in the middle table, and then the black farmers are at the back. I think it also applies in rural governance dynamics. What you would also get, because in our rural communities, the middle tables will be the men, the older men in that space. And we were running a program that was also focused on inclusion for the youth and women. But then what we would hear would be the voices of the men. And then I think it also added a layer of complexity when we tried to address such a challenge, because it was also an uncomfortable situation when we tried to address that, where the men that have influence would have meetings before we engage with them, with the women and the youth, to tell them what they should respond or how they should respond to certain issues. So I think also as researchers, those are some of the issues that you should be cognizant of, and find ways of including those voices that we want to include them. But yeah, thank you so much for the talk. This was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vernani.
It's a perfect note to end it on, getting a voice from practice. So thank you so much, Ralph and Rebecca. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you especially to everyone who's joined for other sessions of our speaker series. As well, as I mentioned, this is the last one of this academic year. So we really appreciate all of you being here and all of our fabulous speakers. Jess has dropped a link in the chat to join our mailing list. So if you want to stay updated on our upcoming events, please sign up if you haven't already, and feel free to share that link with your colleagues who might also be interested. And with that, thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Ralph and Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. It was really great to be part of this and hear your comments and questions. Thank you.